held in sin's dread sway. I'd rather have Jesus than anything this world affords today. I'd rather have Jesus than vain applause. I'd rather be faithful to His dear cause. I'd rather have Jesus than worldwide fame. I'd rather be true to His holy name than to be the king of a vast domain and be held in sin's dread sway. I'd rather have Jesus than anything this world affords today. He's fairer than lilies of rarest bloom. He's sweeter than honey from out the comb. He's all that my hungering spirit needs. I'd rather have Jesus and watch Him lead than to be the king of a vast domain and be held in sin's dread sway. I'd rather have Jesus than anything this world affords today. Amen. It's good singing. Please be seated. I know there's several different meters to sing that song. It's a beautiful song. It's one that gets stuck in my head sometimes in a good way. Got the voice of an angel, boy. What are you talking about? And the blending of the celestial choir right here. All right, you ready, Walt? All right, well, good evening, and it is good to see you all here tonight. And we are back in the book of Esther, and we're going to, Lord willing, complete the book, complete the account of Esther tonight. But as we're turning here, we're going to start really in chapter 5, which is the climax of the book. The stage is set. Everything's going to start coming together, As we're turning there, who can kind of remind me where we are in the book, like as far as what's happened, just in a nutshell so far, just a brief overview. Anybody want to take a stab at what's going on so far? Yeah, what do you think, buddy? What do you think? Tell me about what's happened so far. Talk kind of loud though.
Hasn't Haman made the gallows yet?
Not quite, okay. So somebody kind of tell me what the summary is. Floyd, what do you think?
Wasn't she kind of accepted as a king or a queen?
Yes. So the king. So Esther is the queen now, the queen of the Persian Empire. Big deal. And how did that happen? How did she get to be queen? What happened? Yeah, Adeline?
The former queen Vashti refused to appear before the king, and so he pretty much banished her from the kingdom. And so he needed a new queen.
Yeah, so he needed a new queen. Okay, so he banished her for insubordination, really, for not coming when the king told her to come into the court. And so that's very important. That's a very important point of information. Why is that so? How does that sort of filter into Esther's conundrum? Esther's got a conundrum that she's dealing with. Can anybody else tell me how what Adeline just said factors into that?
Well, Haman wants to kill all the Jews.
Okay.
And
yeah, why is that a problem for Esther? Your mom says.
Because she's a Jewess.
Because she's a Jewess. That's right. Yeah. Okay. What about this conundrum that Esther's in? What's her issue? How long has it been since she's been called into the king? It's been 30 days. Okay. So what's in Esther's heart right now? What sort of pressure is she feeling? No, hang on, buddy. You need to raise your hand. Okay. Anybody?
Mordecai encourages her to go to the king.
Okay, Mordecai encourages her to go to the king. Why?
And because the king's going to kill all the Jews, but
Yes.
the king doesn't know she's Jew.
Right.
So she's supposed to go and plead for the Jews.
Yes, and plead for the Jews. And why would she be hesitant to do that, other than the fact that she's a Jew?
Well, she
Don't
could
kill.
be killed.
Yeah, she could get killed. And why could she get killed just beyond the fact that she's a Jew? Walt?
Because she's not supposed to come before the king unless she's called before the king.
Right.
Right.
Yes.
And adding to what Gigi was saying, Mordecai had mentioned to her that maybe she was put in this position for such a time as this.
Yes, and that sort of brings us up to where we're at. Good feedback, everybody. Very good.
Good memories.
Any other comments before we get started up to chapter 4?
Well, the big thing I've always heard is but God's not in this. God's name is not in this book. But the point is, God is in everything, including our lives, even when we don't believe in Him. He is in everything. There is nothing He is not involved in, and He's involved in this, period.
Preach on, brother. You're right. Now, and that's a big point at the end of chapter 4, and it's a good segue into where we're going. When Mordecai says, he says two things. He says in verse 14, he says, if you, Esther, if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise from the Jews from another place. Now, how does he know that? We said it last week. How does he know that?
God.
Son, if you need to raise your hand, okay, buddy? Okay, I know. I'm glad you're so involved in this. That's great. But just raise your hand for me, okay? So how do we know? How does Mordecai know that deliverance will arise from the Jews? You know, there's an edict by the most powerful man in the world, the king of the Persian Empire, to kill all the Jews, and yet Mordecai is absolutely sure that deliverance will arise. How does he know?
Because the Bible says so.
Because the Bible says so. That's right. That's right. The Bible promises and has prophecies concerning especially the arising of the Messiah that had not taken place yet. And the Messiah would come through the Jewish people. And so Mordecai knows that God will fulfill His word no matter what. The kings of the earth say. So that is definitely evidence of Mordecai's devotion and faith in God right there. He also says, let's see. So he says, if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise from the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. Now that right there speaks of what? God's sovereignty. Yeah. That there's no what's the word? It would make no sense for him to say such a thing if he didn't have faith that someone brought Esther to the kingdom for such a time as this. It speaks of purpose. It speaks of the purpose of Esther's life. And we know that God, one of the applications is that God has a purpose for our life, and He has a purpose for the place that we're in, the time that we live in, the people that are surrounding us in our communities. We are all where we are for such a time as this. But God has put Esther in this place for this particular time. And so Esther resolves that she's going to do the right thing, and she says, if I perish, I perish. And so there's a lot of tension in this part of the book. Esther, could go into the court, and the king, if he doesn't stretch out the golden scepter and welcome her, if he takes her approach as as an affront to his authority, as he did with Vashti, then Esther's done. And yet she's willing to do this. So we see Esther's faith blossom and mature in this way. She asks for the people to fast. Again, who are they fasting to? God. That's right. What are you going to say, buddy?
I was going to say God.
Absolutely. Good answer. So, again, we see the presence of God all through this book. And as Don said, some people say, well, the name of God's not in the book. Well, that's true. But the faith of God's people is clearly in this book, and they have faith in God. All right, so let's see what happens with... let me say one more thing. Verse 17. I didn't say this last week. Mordecai then went away, it says, and did everything as Esther had ordered him. I asked my children in devotions, I said, now, how is it that Esther is ordering Mordecai when in another place in the book, Mordecai is ordering Esther? And Adeline had the answer, so I'm going to let you say what you said. How is it that Esther can order Mordecai, but Mordecai can also order and command Esther?
Mordecai raised Esther, so she still obeys him, and she's the queen, so she can order whoever she wants around.
That's right.
Except the king.
Except the king. That's right. So according to Esther's civil authority, she can command Mordecai. And according to Mordecai's parental authority, Esther is honoring that and honoring Mordecai as a godly leader in her life as well. So it's pretty awesome the way the harmony goes between these two. Okay, so now chapter 5. Chapter 5 is my favorite part, I think, in the book. Chapter 5 and 6, really. So I'm going to start reading, but I call this part of the book the helpless tyrant. This is where it gets really fun. And this is where all the background that we studied last week will really pay off. So what you're going to see is Esther is going to lay her own trap here. She's going to find favor with the king and lay her own trap for Haman. All right, so let's look at chapter 5. On the third day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace, in front of the king's quarters, while the king was sitting on his royal throne inside the throne room opposite the entrance to the palace. And when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, that's where you're supposed to say, what's he going to do? She won favor in his sight, and he held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. Then Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. And the king said to her, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given to you, even to half my kingdom." That's what you want to hear, isn't it? That's just, she was just hoping that he would tolerate her, and instead he says, "You can have up to half my kingdom." And Esther said, "If it please the king, let the king and Haman come today to a feast that I have prepared for the king." And the king said, "Bring Haman quickly, so that we may do as Esther has asked." So the king and Haman came to the feast that Esther had prepared. And as they were drinking wine after the feast, the king said to Esther, "What is your wish? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Even to half my kingdom, it shall be fulfilled." Then Esther answered, "My wish and my request is, if I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it please the king to grant my wish and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come to the feast that I will prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king has said." It's absolutely brilliant what Esther does. Mm-hmm. It's just masterful. So a couple of notes. Esther knows that the king likes her. She's a beautiful woman, and he likes wine. So what does she do? She puts the king at the table with her and with wine. Wine is mentioned throughout this book. It's something that the king really likes. It's mentioned in chapter 1, verse 7, chapter 1, 10 through 11, and throughout the book. And the king is offering her up to half of the kingdom. Now, this phrase was uttered by monarchs throughout the ancient world. It's the highest thing that a king can offer, and it is the highest mark of favor that a king can possibly give. But Esther doesn't take him up on it, does she? What's she do instead? She invites him to another feast. She says that what she really wants, more than the kingdom, is the company of the king. She just loves to be in his presence. She just loves to be around him. what would really fulfill her heart more than all the riches and all the power of the kingdom would just to be with him tomorrow. And the king just eats it up. He just loves it. There is this beautiful woman, the woman of his dreams. She wants to be with him. She wants to have a feast with him again tomorrow. And that is just perfect. Any other comments on that part of anything you noticed or want to speak to in that section of Scripture?
King wasn't very smart, as far as I'm concerned.
Well, he's definitely an interesting character for sure. All right, so
If you saw Esther like you saw.
all right. Okay, so let's look at 5 through 14, the rest of the chapter. We'll see Haman's response here. And Haman. Oh, by the way, what's Haman thinking here? He's just delighted to be invited to the feast, as we'll see. And Haman went out that day joyful and glad of heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, he neither rose nor trembled before him. He was filled with wrath against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home. And he sent and brought his friends and his wife Zeresh. And Haman recounted to them the splendor of his riches, the number of his sons, all the promotions with which the king had honored him, and how he had advanced him above the officials and the servants of the king. Then Haman said, "Even Queen Esther let no one but me come with the king to the feast that she had prepared. And tomorrow also I am invited by her together with the king." That's pretty good, right? But this is how bitterness and jealousy works, okay? And pride. Verse 13. "Yet all this is worth nothing to me, so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting in the king's gate." Then his wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, Let a gallows 50 cubits high be made, that's 75 feet roughly, and in the morning tell the king to have Mordecai hanged upon it. Then go joyfully with the king to the feast. This idea pleased Haman, and he had the gallows made. So Haman is boasting to his family. He should be content, shouldn't he, with the impending judgment and destruction of the Jews that, as far as he knows, is still going to take place. Mordecai's going to die. But Haman can't deal with it. He just can't deal with it anymore. It's eating at him. He's got to see Mordecai die, and he's got to see it happen now. He can't enjoy life until this bitterness in his heart is satisfied. And so what he wants to do, he can't even enjoy this feast tomorrow unless Mordecai's already been dealt with. So notice the order of events. He wants Mordecai to be publicly hanged and bring sorrow upon Mordecai's people. And then he wants to go eat the feast. Only then can he go and enjoy the feast. It shows a lack of judgment. It's a very marked contrast between his earlier tactical planning. In 3:6, he hates Mordecai, but the whole plot against the Jews is so that he's not seen as being a vindictive person. He doesn't want to kill Mordecai alone back in chapter 3. He wants to go ahead and kill all the people so it looks like he's not vindictive. Now he's just frothing at the mouth with rage that he throws caution to the wind. He thinks that he's powerful enough. He thinks that now the king is honoring him as his right-hand man. Esther, the queen, clearly loves Haman and favors him, so he feels bold enough and brazen enough to do this thing. Any other comments on that before we go to chapter 6? Okay. All right. On that night, chapter 6, one of these great coincidences. On that night, the king could not sleep, and he gave orders to bring the book of memorable deeds, the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. And it was found written how Mordecai had told about Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold, who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. I'm just going to go out on a limb and say they had a whole bunch of chronicles. But the place that just happened to be read was the account of Mordecai saving the king's life from these two who were plotting a coup against against the king. The scholars theorize that the reason that they did that, the reason these eunuchs did that, wanted to plot against the king, was because of Esther's ascension to the king's right hand as queen, instead of a Persian girl that they had been, cultivating and so forth and preparing. We don't really know why. We just know that for sure these two eunuchs were going to kill the king. Mordecai intervened, and the king's life was spared. Anybody remember how long ago that was at this point in the book? Okay, I wouldn't expect you to. It's there's a lot of details, but the details really help bring out what's going on. It's been about 5 years since Mordecai did this, and so again, the sheer unlikelihood that this particular place in the Chronicles would be read on this particular night, right before Mordecai is going to, or right before Haman is going to say, "Hey, King, by the way, before we go to the feast, can we just? This guy's really bothering me. Can we just hang him from these gallows that I've got built at my house? The gallows are there. Won't take long." And suddenly the king reads about, or it's read to the king about this because he can't sleep. All these things come together because of God's sovereign hand. God's the one who grants sleep. God would not let the king go to sleep. And again, the book falls open. "Will you read to me so I can fall asleep?" the king says. The book falls open to this. It's the hand of God. And so, in verses 3 through 11, "And the king said, 'What honor or distinction has been bestowed on Mordecai for this?' The king's young men who attended him said, 'Nothing's been done for him.' And the king said, 'Who is in the court?' Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace to speak to the king about having Mordecai hanged on the gallows that he'd prepared for him." So now it's morning. Here comes Haman. "And the king's young men told him, 'Haman is there, standing in the court.' And the king said, 'Let him come in.' So Haman came in, and the king said to him, 'What should be done to the man whom the king delights to honor?' And Haman said to himself, 'Whom would the king delight to honor more than me?' And Haman said to the king, 'For the man whom the king delights to honor, let royal robes be brought, which the king has worn, and let the horse that the king has ridden, and on whose head a royal crown is set.'" So the horse wears a crown. Pretty interesting. Violet wears a crown, sometimes our dog, but it's sort of different. But anyway, okay, so let the horse that the king has ridden and whose head the royal crown is set, and let the robes and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials. Let them dress the man whom the king delights to honor, and let them lead him on a horse through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, 'Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor.' Then the king said to Haman," this has got to be one of the most volatile mood swings in the entire Bible. Haman's on cloud 9 right here, but watch this one sentence. "Then the king said to Haman, 'Hurry, take the robes and the horse as you have said, and do so to Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Leave out nothing that you have mentioned.'" Oh boy.
Haman's going, what?
Oh boy. Yeah, okay. So Haman took the robes and the horse, and he dressed Mordecai and led him through the square of the city. Can you just imagine him holding the robe of the king that he wants so desperately to be on himself? And yet he has to take off Mordecai's rags and put this on him. Can you imagine? Put this on. I don't know how it was. He might have just been completely stunned. So Haman took the robes and the horse, and he dressed Mordecai and led him through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, "Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor." What do you think about that? Ouch for Mordecai. Yeah, well said. Ouch for Haman. Yeah.
Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord.
Yes.
It's also interesting that, Mordecai's enemy, Haman, in this, he's literally was getting ready to kill him.
Yeah.
And yet, God orchestrated the events so that not only was he not killed here, but he was literally exalted and given a royal robe and paraded around the city.
Absolutely. God doesn't just save his life, he honors him and elevates him. It's, you know, and that's what the scriptures say, you know, he will humble those who are haughty and he will exalt the humble. You know, that's a big theme in scripture. So do you have a
I'm gonna say, like you said to Abraham, I will bless those that bless you, and I will curse those that don't.
amen? Yes, young man.
So Haman thought that he was about to wear the king's robes, and he thought that he was about to ride a horse that the king had ridden,
Mm-hmm.
and he thought that he was going to be riding a horse with a crown, and also he had a crown, but instead it was Mordecai.
That's right.
And when Mordecai is being led around the city, that kind of reminds me of the Lion of the tribe of Judah.
Okay. All right. Very good. All right. So, verse 12 through 14. Then Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman hurried to his house, mourning and with his head covered. And Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that had happened to him. Then his wise men and his wife Zeresh said to him, "If Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of the Jewish people, you will not overcome him, but will surely fall before him." While they were yet talking, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried to bring Haman to the feast that Esther had prepared. I bet he really didn't want to go to the feast now. All right. So let's see. Tim, you want to read verses 7 through 6 with gusto? Not too much gusto now.
7 through 6, backwards?
Chapter 7, 1 through 6. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay,
Chapter 7, 1 through 6. Forgive me.
yeah. Okay. Now the king and Haman came to drink wine with Esther the queen. And the king said to Esther, on the second day also, as they drank their wine at the banquet, "What is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Even to half the kingdom it shall be done." Then Queen Esther answered and said, "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me as my petition, and my people as my request." How far do you want me to go?
Go ahead and read through verse 4, actually.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
For we have been For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. Now, if we had only been sold as slaves, men and women, I would have remained silent, for the trouble would not be commensurate with the annoyance to the king.
All right. So, the king, notice how he talks to Esther. He says, "What is it you want, sweetheart? Anything I can give you, I'll give you. It's already granted. All you have to do is say it.
Okay.
If it's anything up to half my kingdom, you can have it. All you have to do is name it." Now, if Esther asks for anything up to half the kingdom, the king can't say no because he's already bound himself by his word to give it. So she's asking. So he's speaking to her in a loving way and in a way that will increasingly make her willing to tell what's on her heart. So when notice how Queen Esther answers as well. She asks for her life, which must have been a surprise to the king, but she carefully sort of unravels this, and carefully speaks. And then in verse 4, she says that she has been sold, she and her people, to be destroyed, She doesn't say by who. She doesn't say by who yet. She's gonna just lay it out there for the king to give him time to digest this and to process what she's saying. She says somebody, without naming who, has caused this. We have been sold. And then she says, and this is just brilliant. If it had just been that we've been sold as slaves, I wouldn't have said anything, because you, king, would still benefit. See, everything's about the king. That's the same tactic that Haman used earlier in the book when he convinces the king to sign the decree against the Jews. He says, these people are a pox upon your kingdom. They're troublemakers. They don't follow your laws, O king. They undermine your authority, king. That's the reason I want to kill them. Not out of any vindictiveness for me. I'm pure as the driven snow, says Haman. But it's only about you. Well, when Esther asks her request, it's not. There's no vengeance here. She's not saying kill Haman. She's not saying destroy him. She's not even naming him. She's saying that I'm going to die, and my people are going to die, and what bothers me about this more than my own death is your loss. The fact that you're going to lose from this, king. If we'd just been sold as slaves, I wouldn't have even bothered you. I wouldn't have taken up your time. Because you could still benefit from us. But if we're dead, then you'll lose. You'll lose something. Our affliction, the ESV says, our affliction is not to be compared with the loss to the king. Our affliction, meaning our wholesale slaughter, is not worthy to compare with your loss of some subjects. Yes, ma'am.
I wonder what it would be like to hear Haman say, for Haman to hear the king say this to Esther when he's just led his enemy through the streets.
That's a good.
On the king's horse.
Yeah, in a less civilized age, I'm sure he'd be trying to interrupt or run or something, but he couldn't, could he? Okay, verse 5. Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther, "Who is he, and where is he, and who has dared to do this?" He's hot. He's furious. "Name him, tell me where he is, he's done." And Esther said, "A foe and an enemy, this wicked Haman." Then, understatement maybe, then Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. Wow. Okay. Let's keep going. All right. Verse 7. And the king arose in his wrath from the wine drinking. Notice he's angry and he's been drinking. Not a good combination. We know the king is prone to make rash decisions in this circumstance, don't we? Back to Vashti. Okay. The king arose in his wrath from the wine drinking and went into the palace garden. He's learning, isn't he? He's learning not to make rash decisions when he's drunk or when he's been drinking. He goes out. A less mature king earlier in the story would have immediately pronounced judgment, perhaps. But at this point, he goes outside. His most trusted advisor has now betrayed the life of his queen, and it's too much for him to process right away. So he steps outside for some air. But Haman stayed to beg for his life from Queen Esther, for he saw that harm was determined against him by the king. He knows what's going on. He can read the king's face. And the king returned from the palace garden to the place where they were drinking wine. So Haman is begging before Esther, before a Jewish woman. Proud Persian, Amalekite is now begging before not just a Jew but a Jewish woman. And the king returned from the palace garden to the place where they were drinking wine, as Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was. And the king said, "Will he even assault the queen in my presence, in my own house?" So what's he think's going on here? He thinks that either Haman is attacking her or he's coming on to her. One of the two. Either way, it's not good. Either way, it's not something the king wants to walk in and see. And it's not something, so Haman is begging, but the king takes it as something else. And he doesn't even have to give the command. He just says, will he even assault the queen in my own presence in my own house? As the word left the mouth of the king, they covered Haman's face. That means they put a bag over his head, basically. And he may never see the light of day again. And he probably the last thing he saw was Esther. Then Harbona, one of the king's eunuchs in attendance on the king, said, by the way, that's a literal translation, by the way. Moreover, the gallows that Haman has prepared for Mordecai, whose word saved the king, is standing at Haman's house, 50 cubits high. Just thought you ought to know, right? Just, Haman's being taken out, and one of the eunuchs, who probably didn't much care for Haman, says, oh yeah, by the way, king, there's some gallows already at his house, and he was going to hang Mordecai on it. And remember Mordecai? He's the guy that saved your life. Just wanted you to remember that. So the king said, hang him on that. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the wrath of the king abated. So Mordecai is groveling, and he's lifted up, but he's lifted up to die. He's lifted up in the lofty. He's given a lofty position, isn't he? It's a lot of irony here. He wants. I'm sorry. Did I say Mordecai? I always get this. I always mix it up. Thank you for your grace. Okay. Thank you for your patience. Haman desires a lofty place. He desires to be lifted up throughout the story. That's what he's all about. And so he finally gets it, and that's where he dies. He's lifted up and given the lofty position that he's always wanted. But this is God's ironic judgment. It's an irony, the way that God ends Haman's life. Okay, thoughts so far?
Well, there's definitely lessons in it for each one of them. I believe the king, the queen, Mordecai, all of them. I think there was a lesson in it with a wonderful twist.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah, well, yeah, except for hanging.
Yeah. Okay. So now we're in sort of the falling action here. There's still an issue. There's still a crisis that hasn't been completely resolved, but the way it's resolved is wonderful. Anybody want to read for a few verses? Kathy, okay. If you read, let's see. Read through verse 8, chapter 8, verses 1 through 8, please.
On that day, King
Ahasuerus, or Xerxes.
Xerxes, thank you, gave to Queen Esther the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews, and Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told what he was to her. And the king took off his signet ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. Then Esther spoke again to the king. She fell at his feet and wept, and pleaded with him to avert the evil plan of Haman and Agagite, and the plot that he had devised against the Jews. When the king held out the golden scepter to Esther, Esther rose and stood before the king, and she said, "If it please the king, and if I have found favor in his sight, and if the thing seems right before the king, and I am pleasing in his eyes, let an order be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, which he wrote to destroy the Jews who are in all the provinces of the king. For how can I bear to see the calamity that is coming to my people? Or how can I bear to see the destruction of my kindred?" Then King Xerxes said to Queen Esther and to Mordecai the Jew, "Behold, I have given Esther the house of Haman, and they have hanged him on the gallows, because he intended to lay hands on the Jews. But you may write as you please with regard to the Jews, in the name of the king, and seal it with the king's ring. For an edict written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's ring cannot be revoked."
Right, thank you. So yeah, and the Haman, the Agagite. He was a descendant of Agag. Remember the king, the Amalekite king that Saul failed to kill, and Samuel had to take matters into his own hands. So again, that's a big theme, as we'll come back to in just a minute. So Mordecai, interestingly, Mordecai is given the king's signet ring. So now Mordecai has been exalted to the second most powerful person in the kingdom, arguably next to Esther. You know, Esther and Mordecai they have incredible power here, and they are both told in verse 8. The "you" there is plural. But both Esther or Mordecai are given permission by the king to write in the name of the king. So you've got a Jew, you've got a male and a female Jew, either of which are able to write in the name of the most powerful monarch on the face of the earth at the time. It's pretty incredible.
Haman had the signet ring at one time.
He did.
And he wrote all the edicts to kill throughout all the land.
That's right. And in verse 2, notice it says the king took off his signet ring which he had taken from Haman. So, you know, we don't know when exactly that happened. It may have been as Haman had the bag over his head. Hang on just a minute, and they took the ring off. I don't know. But either way, so now that signet ring is given to Mordecai, and Mordecai is able to write in the name of the king. Now, all right, let's keep going. So, okay. So verse 9. The king's scribes were summoned at that time in the 3rd month, which is the month of Sivan, on the 23rd day, and an edict was written according to all that Mordecai commanded concerning the Jews to the satraps and the governors and the officials of the provinces from India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces, to each province in its own script and to each people in its own language, and also to the Jews in their script and in their language. And he wrote in the name of King Ahasuerus and sealed it with the king's signet ring. Then he sent the letters by mounted couriers riding on swift horses that were used in the king's service, bred from the royal stud, saying that the king allowed the Jews who were in every city to gather and defend their lives, to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate any armed force of any people or province that might attack them, children and women included, and to plunder their goods. On one day, throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, a copy of what was written was to be issued as a decree in every province, being publicly displayed to all peoples, and the Jews were to be ready on that day to take vengeance on their enemies. So the couriers, mounted on their swift horses that were used in the king's service, rode out hurriedly, urged by the king's command, and the decree was issued in Susa, the citadel. Then Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal robes of blue and white, with a great crown and a robe of fine linen and purple, and the city of Susa shouted and rejoiced. Then the Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor. And in every province and in every city, wherever the king's command and his edict reached, there was gladness and joy among the Jews, a feast and a holiday. And many from the peoples of the country declared themselves Jews, for fear of the Jews had fallen upon them. Okay, so when Mordecai has the king's signet ring, he can write a law, but he can't do something. There's one thing he can't do. What can't he do? He can't undo the law. He can't undo the law that's already been written. Nobody can. Because once a law is written in the law of the Medes and the Persians, it can't be undone. So the simplest thing to do from our perspective would be to say, you know what, the law's revoked. The Jews aren't going to be slaughtered. But he can't do that. What he does, though, is he writes a new law. He counterbalances what's about to happen. And he gives the king's permission for the Jews to defend themselves. Then what the king does is he gives a public endorsement of which side he wants to win. And the side he wants to win is the one that is represented by Mordecai, who is wearing robes of blue and white with a golden crown, a fine robe of linen and purple. And so it's pretty clear that if you follow the former law, which you can do legally and can't be revoked, the king's not going to be happy about it. So what do you think happened?
Now those would be the ones with Haman. Haman brought to be, right? Is that what we're saying? The ones that Haman put into action?
The laws, yes. Mhm.
Right, so they couldn't change it, but we could go in the back door and get it. Okay.
Pretty much, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, so, okay, so the king shows that he's favored Haman. Now, I want to say just as an aside, just very briefly, that Mordecai is a type of. Stop that now. You're as bad as Heather. When I say briefly, she's like, yeah, right. Okay.
No,
You said Haman
Did I switch him again? Okay. Oh, I've got to get it in my head. I know who these characters are. I just don't know why. Okay. Briefly now. Briefly. All right. Thank you, Tim. We're having a good time. All right. So Mordecai is a type of Christ in the story. He's a representative of Christ. Y'all know about typology, in a sense, the patterns in the Old Testament that teaches spiritual truths. And Haman is like a type of Satan. He's a shadow or a type of Satan.
And this question I don't know the answer. Can a woman have that role, Esther?
Yeah.
She's first. So.
Absolutely. Deborah comes to mind. Jael is another. Killing the enemies. All right. So think about it. When Satan lifts himself up and he's cast down to heaven, cast down from heaven, and he sought to destroy Christ. He even wanted to hang Christ on the cross and was successful. But the instrument of the destruction, the instrument that Satan meant for destruction, became the instrument of our salvation, the cross. And the Bible says in Colossians 2:15 that Jesus put the powers of darkness to an open shame by triumphing over them through the cross. And so there's a lot of irony here. Of course, there's differences, and there is in every bit of typology and every analogy. But the cross was supposed to be the instrument of darkness upon which Christ was crucified. And it says if the powers had known, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. But the cross has become the sign of victory, hasn't it, for Christians everywhere. So Christ was told by Satan to bow down before him, just as let me be sure I get this right, Haman told Mordecai to bow down before him. But Christ refused, just as Mordecai refused. And Christ, who was humbled and humiliated on the cross, was ultimately exalted and given the name above every name. Christ is the one who is dressed in royal array. He is the victorious Christ that rides out in the book of Revelation on the steed and on the white horse. And he is certainly the one for whom we cheer, just as they cheered for Mordecai. He is definitely the one in whom we have light and gladness and joy and honor, as we see here. So just some pretty awesome parallels there. Just a few concluding thoughts here. In chapter 9, the day comes, the 13th day, maybe where we get Friday the 13th from, by the way. So the day comes, the king's edict is about to be carried out, and it says, on the very day when the enemies of the Jews hoped to gain mastery over them, the reverse occurred. It's just like the Lord to do this. The Jews gained mastery over those who hated them. Oh, and by the way, in chapter 8, when it says, and many of the peoples of the country declared themselves Jews, this is an Old Testament theme of God showing his power and reaching the nations and bringing people into his covenant people. It happens ultimately, this goes back to the blessing of Abraham. But it happens ultimately where Abraham will be a father of many nations. It happens ultimately in the Great Commission when Christ sends his disciples into every nation. But in the Old Testament, the way of salvation was to become a Jew and to come into Israel, to join yourself with God's covenant people. And so we see that happening through this. A lot of redemptive themes in this book. So
what verse are you on now?
I'm all over the place. Chapter 8. I was just talking about chapter 8, verse 17, but we're also in chapter 9,
Yeah.
verse 2. Yeah.
Okay.
So it says the fear of Mordecai had fallen upon them, verse 3. It says, verse 4, for Mordecai was great in the king's house, and his fame spread throughout all the provinces, for the man Mordecai grew more and more powerful. The Jews struck all their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying them, and they did as they pleased to those who hated them. In Susa, the citadel itself, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men, and also killed the 10 sons of Haman. I'm not going to read all the names. The son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews, but they laid no hands on the plunder. Now that phrase, they laid no hands on the plunder, is repeated in verse 15 and again in verse 16. As this conflict happens, and as the Jews win, they don't take the plunder. As Dr. Doriani, who I don't know, Andy, you remember Dr. Doriani? As he would say, you can have 10,000 bonus points if you can tell me why. Why did they not lay hands on the plunder?
They wanted the king to have it.
That's good. That's a good thought. That's a good guess. The king said they could. The edict said they could, but they don't. Does anybody know why? The most likely reason is because this conflict between the Amalekites and the Jews, all the way back when Saul was ordered to destroy the Amalekites, he was told to do what? Kill them and take no plunder. He was told to take no plunder. And instead he did, didn't he? He did. He took it, and that cost him the kingdom. So they are very intentional when they're dealing with this conflict with their ancient enemies, the Amalekites, to not take any plunder. Now, the Bible doesn't say exactly why they didn't for sure, but I think that's the most likely reason, because of this theme that's woven throughout the book of Esther. Now, yes, ma'am.
Do we know what happened to Haman's wife and his sons?
We know what happened to the sons. We don't know what happened to the wife.
Did they kill the sons?
They killed all 10 sons.
All 10 sons, okay.
And then so they killed all the sons in verses 8 and 8 through 10 of chapter 9. And then Esther is asked in verse 12, again from the king, what is your wish? It shall be granted to you, and what further is your request? It shall be fulfilled. And Esther said, if it please the king, let the Jews who are in Susa be allowed tomorrow also to do according to this day's edict, and let the 10 sons of Haman be hanged on the gallows.
Okay.
So she does that. Now, why does she do that? Well, they're already dead, so why does she have them?
To show people that that's what will happen if they try to mess with the Jews.
Yeah, who taught you that?
You.
You're right. That's a good answer. Yeah, so it's this happened a lot in warfare and so forth, but she's showing them, she's making a statement, don't mess with us. Right? Don't mess with us. Okay, so this becomes the background for the Feast of Purim. What does Purim mean? Anybody remember?
Lots.
Lots. Yeah, it means lots. Pur is the singular word for lot. Im is the masculine plural ending in Hebrew. Purim. So the lots. So plural of lots. And why would they name it lots? Why would they name it that?
Money.
Yes, sir? Do you have if you get this right, I don't know what I'm going to do. Probably shout for joy.
Because they were like breaking a whole bunch of wheat, and whoever got the least lost.
Okay, that's a good guess too. All right. Anybody know?
They were casting lots.
Who was casting lots in the book of Esther much earlier? Not you. You can't answer. Yes, sir?
Haman.
Haman was casting lots. That's right. Why was he casting lots? To decide what? He cast lots for years, by the way.
To build
To decide who descend away from the kingdom.
Good guess, but that's not it. Gigi?
Well, he was building up his treasure so that he could talk the king into
Killing the Jews.
I forgot.
Killing the Jews.
Killing the Jews. Oh, they got so much per head or something.
Yeah, but he's casting lots to consult his pagan gods. and to find out when the right time is to strike out against the Jews. So that's what he does. He casts lots, and when his divining tells him from his pagan gods, now's the time to strike, that's when he puts his plan into action. And so this feast is named for that as an irony, that to show how foolish it is to trust in pagan gods, and to show how God, the true God, absolutely foils the plans of the wicked, even when they seek divine guidance. And so that's what the Feast of Purim is about. It's a day on which gifts were given. There's an explanation. You can read the rest of the chapter, and then chapter 10, all 3 verses of it, to find out some of the details about it. It's celebrated differently. It was celebrated slightly differently in the cities than in the towns. But we find out, multiple things about this that are just glorious. It makes you think of Proverbs 16:33 when it says that the Lord controls even the roll of the dice. And Jesus is thought to celebrate this feast for various reasons in chapter 5 of John's Gospel. It doesn't say exactly which feast it was. It says he went up to celebrate a feast. But supposedly this would be the only feast that would have fallen on a Sabbath, on a Saturday during that time period. So it's very possible. We know that Jesus celebrated the Feast of Hanukkah during his time. Of course, all those feast days were completed by Christ and aren't binding today. But pretty awesome stuff in the book of Esther. And we see the theme that Jesus reiterates: the gates of hell will not prevail against the church. So no matter how dire things look, it doesn't get much worse than what it was looking like in Esther now, does it? We can trust God. We can trust Him.
Reinstated the taxes too. Weren't those out for about 5 years?
They sure were, for about 5 years. So yeah, and in the sort of conclusion, the resolution and everything, yes, he reinstates, he reimposes the tax, and there we go. And chapter 10, verse 3, for Mordecai the Jew was second in rank to King Ahasuerus, and he was great among the Jews and popular with the multitude of his brothers, for he sought the welfare of his people and spoke peace to all his people. May we do the same. Any final thoughts or questions or comments?
This is really good.
Praise God. Awesome book. All right, well, let's pray. Lord, thank you for this time that we've had to study the book of Esther. Lord, we marvel at your sovereign hand, and we thank you for how good you are, how gracious you are, Lord, to your people. We thank you, Father, that if we will yield ourselves to you, that you will use us for the glory of your kingdom, just as Esther yielded herself to you and walked in obedience to you. Bless us, Father, and lead us continually in the green pastures of your word, that we might know you more, and that we might delight ourselves in who you are and what you've done and what you are doing and what you will do. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
What about next Wednesday?
I don't know. I've got a couple ideas. Actually watching a pretty awesome video